Hi everybody. My name is Liron, and I'm the National Director of the Tzofim chapters in North America. I'm very excited to be here today and host this panel, and with me there are two very interesting speakers, which I'll present right now. First, Professor Ruth Wisse. She's a Professor Emeritus of Yiddish Literature and Comparative Literature at Harvard University. And Natan Sharansky is the founding director of the Shlichut Institute and the former chairman of the executive of the Jewish Agency, and as we just talked before, an extraordinary chess player. So thank you both for being here today. We're going to talk about anti-Semitism, and the title is Anti-Semitism. Is it a new or an old road or way? And it's going to be an open conversation. I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions, and then we'll open it to questions from the audience. So first of all, for your opening statement or beginning of our discussion, I think it's important to ask, how would you define the term anti-Semitism? Because in American society, freedom of speech is, to some extent, above all. What are the boundaries between legitimate criticism and an anti-Semitic act or statement?
I am extremely honored to be here with Natan Sharansky, whom I admire almost as much as any human being on this earth, and also with Shlichim from Israel, whom I admire more than anyone else. My first encounter with Shlichim was when I was 15 years old at a summer camp. It made a fantastic impression on me. So you cannot imagine how important your role is. And at some point, I would like to argue during the course of our conversation that it's even more important for America than it is for you and for the Jews and for Israel and for all that you think it's important for. It's particularly important that you do your job well for America. This is the first time in my life when I worry more for the future of America than I do for the future of Israel. And I hope that something I can say will make that a little clearer. So in terms of this question, it's totally phony. It has nothing to do with criticism of Israel. Who here does not criticize? We are the most self-critical people that ever existed. And you don't know what it is to be a Jew until you begin to criticize everybody and criticize yourself and so forth. It has nothing to do with criticism. Israel is being blamed. Blame is not criticism. And it's being blamed for one thing in particular. It is being blamed for the misery of the Palestinians. And Israel has never done anything, can never do anything, and will never do anything, and is incapable of doing anything to improve the lives of the Palestinians, and has never done anything bad to the Palestinians. So the idea of holding Israel responsible for what's wrong with the Palestinians, holding Israel responsible for what's wrong with the Arab world, is the greatest lie. It is the root of anti-Semitism. It is the root of all negative politics. And the Jews have often been in this position. Jews were responsible for capitalism. Jews were responsible for the fact that the middle class could not rise in Poland. Jews were responsible for the fact that they were undermining Germany. Jews were responsible for the fact that the French army was failing. Jews were responsible. That is really basically the blame that constitutes anti-Semitism. So one thing I would plead with everybody, never confuse criticism with blame. And if Israel is being blamed for anything having to do with, all you have to do is take out the map, show them the Arab world, much larger than the United States of America, and say, pick your country, pick your Arabs, pick anything. Jews are not responsible for anything, and it's the Arabs who have put the Palestinian Arabs in the position that they're in. They are wholly responsible for that. And to some extent, of course, the Palestinians are responsible for themselves. So this is how I would answer it. Never admit to the absurdity of the idea that you cannot criticize Israel.
It's very difficult to compete with Professor Wisse in passion.
Passion doesn't count.
Yeah, but no, your passion and compassion is something. And I'm also honored to be with you on the stage, but you can't even imagine how much more difficult you made just now the work of our shlichim, because we were explaining, and we're explaining all these years that I was and continue to explain that the future of Jewish people and relations with Israel is on their shoulders. Just now you said, and the future of the United States of America is on your shoulders. So really you ask too much. It's, we can feel some responsibility for elections in Israel, and I'm very happy that we solved all these problems with participation of shlichim in elections 2 elections ago, but we are not responsible for elections in America. So let's define the borders of our responsibility. I agree that it is blame, it's not criticism, but in practical situation, we all are challenged. First time I was challenged to give definition to this new anti-Semitism was in the times of the second Intifada, when we in Israel were really feeling very strong that we are in the forefront of the struggle against global terror. 1 year, not 1 year, half a year after 9/11, and here we have Intifada and suicide bombing in Jerusalem, all over Israel. In 1 month, 130 people killed. In a year, almost 1,000 people killed. And we take very difficult decisions, the government. I was in the cabinet decision about Chomat Magen, about defensive shield. And we decided we have no choice, but we have go to Jenin and to other places from where terrorists are coming and where all these factories of terror are working. And we have special decision that though we will go in the middle of this, we will not use tanks and artillery in order not to have thousands of victims of Palestinians. There, in Kasbah, Jenin, there were 13,000 people, and practically in every house there are traps, there is explosive materials. And we send our soldiers from house to house. As a result, 56 terrorists are killed, 23 Israelis from Golani are killed, and it stopped the second Intifada. It was very successful in military terms. Some of Israelis, including my own nephew who was fighting in Jenin, accuse us that you, Israeli government, in order to avoid criticism, to save some lives of Palestinians, you are ready to sacrifice the lives of soldiers. He was in Golani and 23 soldiers of Golani were killed. And then I come to America, to the campuses, and here is this awful film, Jenin, about thousands of Palestinians who were buried alive there. Of course, everything's lie. It's proved immediately everything's lie. And one campus after another, the first was in York. One student tells me, for me as a liberal Jew, it will be better if Israel doesn't exist. Then I am not responsible for all these awful crimes. And by the way, the project Israeli Fellows and Campuses was born from this. Then I came back to Israel and said to Ariel Sharon, it is by far the most important battlefield for the future of Jewish people. But I, as a minister, am speaking all the time about this awful demonization of Israel which is happening. And one after the other leaders of the free world say, look, you are trying to shut up our mouths. It's legitimate criticism. You're fighting, there is, okay, Intifada, but there is occupation. There are many injustices which you're doing. We cannot speak about it. And then I came with this definition of 3D, which today became part of international definition. I said, let's look what weapon anti-Semites used against Jews for 1,000 years. It doesn't matter whether it was anti-Semitism in antique times or Christian anti-Semitism or national anti-Semitism. It was always about demonization of Jews. And through all the history, the sons of the devil, demonization of Israel, of Jews in different forms. It's about delegitimization of Jews. And it's about double standard. I have a book at home, 1,000 Laws of Russia, where there are different standards for Jew than for non-Jew. I said, let's see, when criticism of Israel crosses this border and turns into demonization of Israel, or when the right of Israel to exist denied, the legitimization, or clear different standard, like in the Human Rights Council in the United Nations, where Israel is condemned more than all dictators in the world together. So you must really have very different standard about violation of human rights in Israel than in any other most democratic or most dictatorial regime if you condemn Israel more than all the dictators together. Then it is anti-Semitism. And I propose then this analogy with 3D film. You go to 3D film, you put, if you don't put 3D spectacles, you will not understand what you're watching. But the moment you put it, you understand. So apply this criteria, and we'll see. By the way, criticism of Israel, here Ruth told better than anybody else, the Jew who will stop criticizing Israel for one day, he will stop being Jew. Who is a Jew? The one who criticizes Israel. Actually, a politician who will stop criticizing Israel in Israel has no future. It doesn't matter from left to right. So, but when somebody comes to Israel and says, I was in Palestinian refugee camp, it's awful. You know, it's absolutely legitimate. He will say, it's impossible that fifth generation live there. It's legitimate. I can disagree why they're there. But when he says, and I was there, and that is Auschwitz of today, well, that's what Nobel Prize laureate said. You know, I was many times in refugee camps. And I was only once, not twice, I was in Auschwitz. You don't need more than 1 minute to know that that's demonization. So I recommend everybody to use this, to try simply to look at the text. And it can be very critical text about Israel. And it's not anti-Semitism. It's legitimate disagreement. But the moment you see that, in fact, like in BDS, look what the founders are saying, they're denying the right of Israel to exist, that's anti-Semitism. In any form, denial of Israel to exist in any form. They are comparing Israel with Nazi Germany, that's anti-Semitism. And of course, if they apply, that's the most often thing, very different standards to Israel than to America, or to Britain, or to France, or to any other country, that's also anti-Semitism.
Well, Natan's categories are obviously helpful. Yes, I will be interested in the moment when you can use the moment to analyze the differences between one category and another. But you, particularly when you began, you absolutely proved my point. You can take any precautions you want. You can be the most careful people in the world. Israel is the most wonderful country in the world, the most remarkable. I can prove it on every level, relatively speaking, when you take these relative categories. Has absolutely nothing to do with anti-Semitism. Let me begin at the beginning. I have the only privilege I have here is certainly not knowing more than you about the subject. You are in the trenches. I'm only in the trenches when I put myself there, but I am older than all of you, and I've lived with this question for all of my life, literally all of my life. What is it? And I will tell you that anti-Semitism is something very specific. It began in the 19th century. It was formulated as a political ideology, a political movement, and a political strategy. And it's a brilliant, brilliant strategy. I have called it the most successful ideology of modern times. And I would like to see someone disprove that. It became part of fascism. It became part of communism. It now became part of Islamism and part of nationalist movements. It unites internationalists and nationalists. It unites religious and anti-religious. It is a phenomenal instrument of politics. And what it is the politics of the pointing finger. You point at the Jews. You point at Israel. Israel. You make Israel the subject. That's all you have to do in a conversation. All you have to do is make Israel the subject. If you take the map of the Middle East and you start looking at all these countries, the map of the Middle East, by the way, bigger than America, and all these countries, something wrong with every single one of them. But the Arab League formed in 1945 around one unifying principle. The only thing that could unify the Arab world was unification against first the creation of Israel and then the existence of Israel. And in order to do that, you had to keep the Palestinians homeless. You had to keep them homeless. You could not partition Palestine. You had to keep them homeless so that you could blame Israel for the homelessness of the Palestinians. The Arab world will never allow the Palestinians to be settled as long as it needs Israel as a point of accusation, as a point of blame. So I would say we are Jews in a very difficult situation. I don't think there's any one of you who wants to believe me. And certainly the students who you want to speak to are not going to want to believe you. No one wants to see themselves in this situation. You mean to say I'm an instrument of politics, an instrument of blame for others, and it's not my fault? And there's nothing I can do really to correct this situation, really? Is that what you're telling me? Well, in a sense, I am saying to you, you have to rise above yourselves. We want to make ourselves the subject. Natan is right that this self-criticism, ashamnu, bagadnu, gazalnu, dibandu, this is, if Jews raise a fist, they raise a fist in order to smash their own chests with it. Right.
That's only before the state of Israel existed. Now we
so then let me just end on this. I'm sorry to go on like this. So my point to you is this, that you always have to listen. It's not just delegitimation and the 3 points that you make. You have to understand why Israel is being made the subject and try to turn the subject to the accusers, not to the accused.
Okay.
So, Professor Wisse, I listened to a podcast in which you say, and you just said right now that anti-Semitism is a political tool, and it serves political interests, meaning that the hatred towards Jews, it's a conscious choice. So I want to ask you both, why Jews? Why throughout history Jews have been the subject of hatred?
I didn't come here for self-promotion, but I wrote a book called Jews and Power, and it was translated last year into Politica, Paradox HaPolitica HaYehudit, available in Hebrew, and where I try to explain how the Jews got into this situation. It's very paradoxical. The Jews got into this situation in a way because they don't need enemies. We don't need enemies. We have made a specialty of accommodation. We are used to living among 70 nations, 700 nations. Are you worried about living among other nations? I never met a Jew who wasn't eager to learn other languages, to live among other nations, no problem. And so for 2,000 years, we developed the habits of accommodation, fitting in. What do you need? You need shoemakers, tailors? That's what we'll do. You need money changers? That's what we'll do. You need soldiers? We'll be your soldiers. Jews are marvelous at being a startup nation, helping water supplies in other countries, this and that. Do I have to tell you? Helpfulness. This is our role. We are a small people by self-definition. We don't look to be imperial. We don't want to conquer other people. Now, if you take this little nation that goes here and there and fits in everywhere and is so helpful everywhere, and you are helpful among nations who are exactly the opposite of you, they don't want to fit in anywhere. As a matter of fact, anti-Semitism in the Middle East is a refusal to accept the principle of coexistence. What Israel represents is the principle of coexistence. If I accept the presence of Israel, it means I accept the presence of coexistence of other groups in the Middle East. So the nigud, the organization of politics against Israel is essentially very much the organization of politics against the principle of coexistence. Never mind the Kurds. The Kurds, you know, are a huge problem. And of course we want the Kurds to have their own country as well. But that's why I say our role is bigger than ourselves, whether we like it or not.
Okay, I will continue from here. The only thing that I feel that I disagree with Ruth is I fully agree that because we insist to be different. But anti-Semitism is at least 3,000 years more ancient. And Yeshkan Am Mevudad, there is people who live on their own. That's what Aman said, and that was the base for his anti-Semitism. And that's what Paro said in Egypt, if you remember, that the first anti-Semitic statement in the Bible, that they live separately from us, they have different gods, and who knows where it will take them. And, well, I didn't write books about this, but I wrote an article like 20 years ago on hating the Jews, where I tried to analyze different types of anti-Semitism through centuries, and they said the only thing which I could find common for this is that Jews always studied against the stream. They stick to religion, and then Christianity, which is part of Judaism, which came out of Judaism. And it was so natural for all the first Christians that Jews are part of them, but then all the world accepts it. All the world accepts it, and Jews don't accept. And all the anti-Semitism of Augustinus is exactly about it. That we have new covenant, Brit Hadasha. Why do you Jews who created this Brit, why do you insist? And that was the beginning of huge Christian anti-Semitism, and so on and so on. Today, if you ask today, there is huge postmodern movement against national states, and Jews, I can quote different people who said simply, Israel had to appear in the 19th century when national states were offered. Now it's against all the fashion. Who needs national states? So it's on one hand, we have to stand against this postmodern idea of fighting against national state. On the other hand, there is new nationalism, which is a counterattack, because this postmodernism went so far and denies identity so strongly. So one after another, it was only Le Pen, but now it's like 20 different national parties who want to go back to our national pride. And they are, all the Jewish world says, okay, but nationalism has its limits. We have to be a democratic state. And so we, at the same time, we are in the Middle East where everybody is dictator, and we say, no, we are democratic. And we are part of the free world, which is against national states, and we say, no, we are a Jewish state. So we stick to our beliefs for 1,000 years, and as a result, we are becoming, as Ruth said, but we are living among the other nations. So the other in Europe, there were many enemies in Europe, but the only one who was permanent, very comfortable to be against is Jews. And the same way we can say about new anti-Semitism.
I don't think we disagree in any way. It's just that we look at this very, very differently. I grew up, Pesach was a very big holiday in our family. And every year one had to say, B'chol dor vador, omdim aleinu l'chalotenu. What is this? At a certain point, I said to myself, you know what? Your question, why? And I'm not satisfied with the answer that B'chol dor vador omdim aleinu. You know, I lived in North America for many years, and if you had been here, if we had had this gathering in the 1950s, in the 1960s, even in the first part of the 1970s, we would never have been talking about anti-Semitism. We would have been talking about what you should teach the children here. Should we teach them a lot of Tanakh? Should we teach them more about contemporary Israel? Should we teach them about religion? I mean, we would be arguing among ourselves about what to teach them. We would never have mentioned anti-Semitism once before 1975. Everything changed in 1975. The Arab world had lost 2 wars against Israel, but it was about to win a very huge war that it has been winning ever since. It won that war at the United Nations. Who pays any attention at the United Nations? Shmum, you know, as the great Ben Gurion said. It's true, but it's also not true. They hit on a marvelous thing, that Zionism was racism. This is a monstrous idea. The Arabs who wouldn't accept a Jewish state accused the Jews of not accepting an Arab state. A complete inversion, which is what anti-Semitism is, an inversion. You blame the Jews for the aggression against them. But somehow it passed. The United States fought it so vigorously that Daniel Patrick Moynihan said that the passage of that was a day of infamy. Do you know what that expression is? A day of infamy is what Roosevelt called Pearl Harbor, the attack on Pearl Harbor. And he called that a day of infamy to say how horrible it was. Nevertheless, it took till 1991 before the United States could have that revoked at the United Nations. But by that time, it had spread. It had spread on campuses, and not spontaneously. This was pushed by Arab representatives, by Arabists teaching in the universities, by all kinds of media. This was done very deliberately. And just one thing here, look what that did. Do you understand what that did to say that Zionism is racism? It flipped the political valence, the political idea of anti-Semitism from the right to the left. Until 1975, the Arabs said, we're going to push the Jews into the sea. We're going to push the Jews into, it sounded like imperialism, it sounded like Nazism, it sounded horrible, it sounded like the right, we're going to push you. Suddenly, in 1975, ingeniously, look, these are brilliant ideas. You have to give your opponent the benefit of his intelligence. They flipped it over and they said, no, Zionism is racism. It's the Jews who are denying. And suddenly, the Palestinians became the victims of the Jews. Suddenly, on every campus, it's a leftist cause. Suddenly, the Palestinians are the leftist cause. They are the organizing cause of the left on campuses. That's why you have such problems with them. So you see, this is really an amazing switcheroo. This is an amazing thing to say that Zionism was racism. How are you going to counter that? How are you going to push that back? You have 30 years of indoctrination, 30 years of left-wing propaganda of this kind.
If
What?
it's from 75, it's 45 years.
45
So
years.
You failed to defend us then, and now we have to pay, yeah?
So I'll continue. You both talked about you talked about, Mr. Sharansky, about the controversy of national states and the role that the state of Israel plays in anti-Semitism issues. So I want to ask, part of my job as a shlicha is working with Jewish Israelis who live in the United States. And I can say that as soon as our participants finish their time in the Israeli Scouts and go off to college, they're really afraid to say where they came from. They're afraid to say that they're Jewish, they're afraid to say they're Israelis. And I want to ask about the role that the state of Israel plays in the fight against anti-Semitism. Does the state of Israel tilts the scales in favor of a struggle against anti-Semitism, or the other way around?
I think that one of the things that you have to say to young people here is, look, I think the greater the demands that you make on the people that you're speaking to, the better you will be at your jobs. And you will say, what? You want us to make you look good? That's not my job. Your job is to make us look good. Our job is not to make you look good, American Jews. What do you have to worry about? Your job is to make us look good. And here's how you do it. Every one of us has to serve 3 years in the army, 2 years in the army, some of us 5 years, and then for the rest of our lives, you have got to serve 2 or 3 years in the army of words. You've got to learn to fight the political battle, which is even more important at this point than the military battle that we are. We'll fight the military battle. We're not asking you necessarily to come and be lone soldiers, although some of you can. You've got to learn how to fight back on the campuses, how to make the arguments. Now, they keep shifting. You know, the ground keeps shifting under us. They keep changing the language. Intersectionality wasn't even a word 10 years ago. Now suddenly it's intersectionality. You've got to stay on top of it. And you know how we train for the army? We don't train for defensive warfare. If the war against Israel ever had to be fought on Israeli soil, do I have to tell you? It's an impossibility. So it's the same thing. Don't let the war of words ever be fought about Israel's nature. Let it be fought about why you can't accept Israel, why you have to single out this tiny people. Try to find Israel on the map. It's hardly there. You know, we used to play this game, Where's Waldo? Where is Waldo on the map? Are you going to really tell me that this is the country you want to blame? Teach them how to defend by attacking. Teach them really what one says as in fencing. You've got to do that. You've got to make demands on them. They've got to serve for 3 years in the army of words.
Well, I cannot even start with this. To compete with this passion and compassion. And of course, I heard her in Harvard, and believe me, Harvard, well, some of you know it's unfortunately, one of the most problematic places for the freedom of speech today. And if I need example of how Jews are standing against the stream and are not afraid to say our truth, that's the best example which we have. But now we are coming back to the reality in which our shlichim are working, and they are really there after Golani and after Sayerot and after Shmona Matayim. They are the best that we have, and they have to convince young American Jews that they have nothing to be embarrassed. They have all the reasons to be proud. And to say that it's easy, not. That the one who's dealing with this last 20 years, from that student who told me that for me as a Jew it will be better if Israel doesn't exist, to that lady in Harvard on business school who told me she wants to sign a letter in support of Israel, but she knows that there are at least 3 professors who are very important for her career, and they will not like it. And that's why she decided to be silent. Not for a long time, for a couple of years, not more. But then her career will be successful. And I thought, my God, she's not in Moscow. In Moscow, we really thought like this before we became Zionists. And I was in the institute like Harvard. And that's exactly how we felt. She's not there. She's in Harvard, in the center of the free world, and she's afraid to express her Jewish sympathy to the state of Israel. That's what we have to do. But answering your question whether it is good or bad, all our power to defend ourselves as Jews, and doesn't matter where we live. And I think I was practically in every Jewish community in the world. The moment you take away this connection to Israel, even from people who are very critical, their connection, nothing will save them. Their grandchildren will not be Jewish. Of course, faith helps and connection with Israel. Without Israel, modern Jewry will not exist. And in terms of defense, it's not accidental that now in Halle, when there was, it was Israel which helped protect that synagogue, and we Jewish agency playing only a very small role in this protection. But in fact, all the Jewish communities of the world depend on Israel, but also symbolic, the very fact that Jews have their own say, their own standing in the world. They can stick to their tradition, to their people without fear to disappear, it's only because of Israel. And of course, I know it is very difficult. I know it is very challenging. I know you have to find a lot of ways to reach these students, but that's your work. That's why you're here.
So before we open it to questions from the audience, the question that follows for me is: do you think there's a real danger that anti-Semitic or anti-Israel ideologies, who you consider the new anti-Semitism in one of your articles, will sweep away young, liberal Jewish Americans that are not affiliated with Israel or do not feel connected? And is it a real danger for us?
Yeah, of course. Listen, do I have to tell you that it's a danger? But you know, the worst anti-Semites, or some of the worst anti-Semites in history, have been Jews. And that is understandable. If the war against you is real, and as you say, it is real, if there is a real aggression against you, there are going to be a lot of people who will fold. They won't be able to stand up to aggression. You know many people like that. That can be a very nice quality in people. The most delicate people, the most sensitive people, can sometimes not stand up to aggression. Now the answer is, there are two things. Because it's a free country here, these people can just simply disappear on campuses. They don't want to identify. You know, what can I say? Personally, I can't admire such Jews, but I have nothing against them. You don't want to associate yourself with the Jews? That's fine. But the ones that I blame are the ones who they want to hold Israel responsible for the aggression against it. Those are intolerable. And you have to fight them. You have to fight them the same way as you fight other anti-Semites, because they are simply Jewish anti-Semites. They organize politics against the state of Israel. They blame the state of Israel for the condition of the Arabs. They are prepared to do that publicly, and there's no other way of putting it. You know, go into the disputations in the Middle Ages. The disputations against Nachmanides, the disputations were former Jews who turned, and they became the experts against the Jewish people. So you have to expect that on campuses. And I'm sorry to say, now again, the tactics, I'm not a tactician. But you have to be careful, the tactics. You can't use rough tactics with smooth. You have to figure out the right tactics, but you have to know that that's the goal. You have to expose these people. You cannot allow them into a big tent. Anti-Israel Jews are not part of a big tent. And Natan said he cannot imagine Jewish people without the state of Israel. Listen, I don't think there should be a Jewish people if we don't have the state of Israel. I would not want an American Jewry if there was no state of Israel.
Well, only one phrase to add, because there is not much to add to what Ruth said. On the one phrase, I am not concerned. You said, should we, Israel, be concerned? Is it a threat to us that these Jews are distancing themselves from Israel? It's not a threat to us. We have many problems, but in the end, we know how to fight our wars. It's not a threat to us. Is it a threat to Jews who are distancing themselves from Israel? Yes, it's definitely a threat to them. And the difference between me and Ruth is that Ruth says that they don't deserve to exist. You said you don't want them to be. I want them to be nevertheless. And that's why I think it is very important for us to help them to reconnect themselves to Israel.
Okay, we will now open it to questions from the audience. So if you have a question, just raise your hands.
Well, first of all, Professor, thank you for these words of wisdom, which 30 years ago would sound mainstream, but nowadays it's a bravery to say them. That's my personal take on it. On a different matter, anti-Semitism. It's obviously a big problem, but I'm wondering, is it such a big problem in the context of delegitimizing of State of Israel? Let's say that I have a criticism about Israel that is legitimate by any standard. But I also happen to be an anti-Semite. Does it diminish of the argument that I'm making? It might sound like it is. I mean, the argument should stand or fall on its own merit regardless of the labels which you put on me. Just like we're being accused of being racists, whatever label you put on me, did I make a right argument? So what's your take on that?
It's a little bit, it reminds me of a little bit of a Talmudic refinement in this. It's a question. Answer it any which way you want. That's not the problem we're facing. You know that. Fine, so the anti-Semite just says something. What can I think of? Did you ever read Mein Kampf? You think there's nothing that he says about the Jews which is true? So is that what you want? Yes, of course, you can find something. You don't think that there's a criticism that the fascists leveled against us that was legitimate? Come on. Yeah, but that's not what we're facing. And that's why I say that America's at stake. What I meant to say by that is that anti-Semitism is a poison for the country that uses it. There is no country that I know of that can survive anti-Semitism coming into power. Anti-Semitism destroys the society that embraces it because it is a false ideology. It blames others for one's own problems that it refuses to solve. Should America begin to elect people who are anti-Semites and to go in that direction the way Britain is going, should it go in that direction and become an anti-Semitic country, then you know what will happen. This country is very young. The Jewish people is old, tried. That's why I say we are much more stable with all our instability than you might think. America's very young. It's very fragile. And it can be blown away very easily. And these people who are now being elected on a platform of anti-Semitism, that is the first time in American history that that is happening. It is really very rotten. And so the more one can do to make America itself again, that is to say, pro-Israel, because it's a strong and wonderful nation, our fighting front line in the Middle East, anyone can see it. The good of the world is certainly more represented by Israel than it is by other countries in the Middle East. It seems muvan me'elav, right? So to make it clear.
Thank you very much for sharing your wisdom and experience with us, that's first of all. These days we see many Israelis, millennials and young people in general, leaving Israel sometimes for good, sometimes temporary, to different countries such as the US, Germany, all over Europe, striving for new opportunities, feeling that they are now part of a more global society and they don't necessarily need to live in Israel anymore, and the world now is more open and accepting place, and they basically are assimilating themselves in the new societies they live in. Is there a lesson that we are missing here? Is there a message you would like us to know about that? I'm very curious about that. Thank you.
Thanks for asking this question. Natan, I don't know how you feel about it. Look, I am a failed Olah. So what can I tell you? We tried to make Aliyah at some point in our lives. It did not work for our family. However, part of our family now lives in Israel. My niece is there, her children, many grandchildren. Some of our children will go and move there. My in-laws' children are there. You can't take 2,000 years of global wandering around, and even before that, Babylonian exile and so on. Israelis are going to come abroad and they're going to go back. There is no life as good as the life of an Israeli. The happiness factor there is higher than anywhere else. Yes, I must say, for all the problems, it's not for nothing that people we know move from the Upper West Side to Israel, and their children move there. They know what good, in Yiddish you would say, "Sie wissen was gut ist." They know what's good. So I am not so worried about Israelis. What I will say is that somebody founded an organization in this country called the Israel-America Council. You're aware of it. Now that has changed things dramatically, because before then, we never harnessed the Israelis in this country. The Israelis in this country did not stand up and say, we are American Israelis, we are Israelis in America. And to be able to say that and fight for the country from here and bring the movies and the language, particularly the language, American Jews have got to start learning much more Hebrew than they speak. So the fact that these kids are being brought up in Hebrew and going to Hebrew camps and becoming instructors, Hebrew will spread here through them. It's extremely important. So I would look at it as much as possible as a potential asset as well.
Well, I definitely will not go so far as to say that that's asset, but but I really changed, influence on the policy of Jewish Agency when I came here. First of all, insisting not to see anti-Semitism as the biggest ally of Zionism. That there are until today there are politicians who believe that anti-Semitism is not a bad thing because it pushes people to Israel. It's nonsense. I was fighting against it, and I was the one who insisted that Jewish Agency has to work with Israelis in America, because before there was policy, Jewish Agency could not even hire the person to their work in, let's say in Denver. I need somebody, local worker. If he is the one who came from Israel 15 years ago, he cannot be hired by Jewish Agency because that's anti-Zionism. It's all we changed 10 or 8 years ago. So I'm not right. By the way, it's wrong to think that today there are bigger waves of Israelis who are leaving Israel. It's wrong. There were much bigger ways, and in fact, when every Aliyah is accused that they are all leaving, like with Russia today, with France, figures are all the same. For every Aliyah, 10% are leaving after this, if there is not something very special, but 90% stay. Now, your question sounds as if you're speaking about different world when you're saying the world is becoming more welcoming and more opening. Anti-Semitism is the most primitive anti-Semitism, not even new anti-Semitism. The most primitive anti-Semitism is on the rise practically in every part of the world. Well, Moscow is relatively more safe today than most of the other parts of the world in terms of, but I don't believe that that's what will help us. What brings people to Israel or what them to live? Ruth is absolutely right. The quality of free Jewish life, which exists in Israel, doesn't exist anywhere. And people, sooner or later, in different ways, they feel it. And by far the most optimistic society in the free world, statistically, there are studies. The society which brings more children to this world than any other country in the free world, disproportionately. That's one of the parameters of optimism. And with all other problems, one of the most creative parts. That's in the end what will bring them back. I don't think that whether they will be welcomed or not welcomed, because in the end, today it's not a problem to get a green card. Today it's not such a big problem to get citizenship in Canada, in Australia. So the fact is that most of the people who live discover the big advantages of our life, and that's exactly what you have to sell. I don't think that we can sell anti-Semitism. And unfortunately, again and again I hear it, oh, there is another anti-Semitic incident. Why they stay there? Why they stay in Europe? I don't believe there is any future for Jews in Europe, but I don't think that it is anti-Semites who will bring them to us. It's only our quality of life.
Okay, so thank you both so much, Professor Wisse, Mr. Sharansky. It was very interesting, and for me, even optimistic to hear your words. And I really want to thank you both. It was a pleasure.
would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. And we're especially pleased to remind you that thanks to a generous matching gift from the Cayley family, every new or increased dollar you donate to JBS will be worth double to JBS. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please, indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, P.O. Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.